In this video, we're going to show you how to prime your MDF skirting board at home. It can also be applied to other MDF mouldings such as Architrave, dado rails and panel moulds. MDF needs to be primed prior to painting as it creates a seal and also absorbs the paint for a better finish and durability. We're going to be using Dulux Trade Quick Dry Wood Primer Undercoat. We're using this because it's from a reputable and easily accessible brand as well as being quick dry. And this is some of the equipment that we'll be using. A roller brush and tray and an 1.5 inch flat brush to apply the primer, a screwdriver to pop open the tin of primer, a Dulux stick which has been provided with the primer so we can give it a good mix, some sandpaper for when we need to prep the boards, and the masking tape is optional if you decide to prime it on the wall rather than before, but we'll get into that later in the video. So firstly, we're going to show you how to prime your boards prior to fitting them. A benefit of this is that you can do it at hip height, which is more comfortable as opposed to being on your hands and knees if it's fitted to the wall, which you'll see later on in the video. A potential negative is that you may not have the space or appropriate table or bench to prime these, as it can take a few hours when you factor in drying times. We've got 2 pieces of skirting and 3 pieces of architrave laid on our bench ready to be primed. If you're doing this at home, you may want to cover and use something like a dining table or a garden table. So firstly, we're going to pop open our tin of primer with a screwdriver and give it a good stir with our stirring stick. Really try and stir the whole mix from the bottom. When you're done, pour the primer into the tray, and once it's in, you're going to want to get the roller brush completely coated and soaked through with primer. And before we put any primer on our boards, give them a quick brush over so that it removes any dust or bits which may show up when primed. So to the priming. On our skirting board, we're going to sit it up so that we can apply the primer to the top edge of it. We just want a thin layer of primer applied and make sure that every part of the top edge is covered. Once done, we can move to the flat section of our skirting board. As our brush is quite wet, we're going to dab some of the primer onto the board so that it's easier to brush along, as like we've said previous, we only want a thin layer of primer on the board. As you can see, using the roller brush on the flat section makes life easier as you apply it to the board quick and easy. And don't worry if the brush is catching the profile section on the board. Do this until the whole of the flat section is complete. Now we're going to use our flat brush for the profile section as we need some flexibility to get in between the curves and the grooves. It may take you a little longer to do this, but really focus on covering all the profile section and making sure it's only a light coat that is being applied generously. Once you're done, have a check over your board to see if there's any sections that you may have missed, and you can give them a touch up just like you can see here. We're not sure if it's as boring as watching paint dry, but here's a quick time lapse of the whole process. With architrave, it may take longer for a couple of reasons. Firstly is that you have 2 edges to paint because they show up when fitted, comparing to skirting which only has 1 when fitted. Secondly, the flat section of the architrave tends to be smaller, so there's more flat brush work, especially if it's a more detailed profile like the one that we're working with. But the same principles apply. Completely cover the area needed with a light coat and make sure you touch up any missed parts. A couple of things that come up while we was priming the architrave. The first is that a loose hair came off our brush and onto the board, so make sure you're looking out for things like that. And secondly is that we had a clump of primer together. If you do come across this, just brush them out as like we said previously. A thin coat is crucial and we don't want any lumps or bumps showing up. Once done, it's time to let our first coat of primer dry. Even though this is a quick dry primer, our tin tells us that we have to wait between 2 to 4 hours for our next coat. As you can see here, the boards are not completely white and you can still see through to the boards in parts, but that's fine. This is our first coat of primer, and at this stage it's important to just get a thin first coat on. These boards will still need a second coat of primer and a top coat. Once the boards have dried, you'll need to prep your boards, and this is where the sandpaper comes in. If you feel across the boards, particularly the profile section, it will still feel quite rough. When the boards have been primed, the MDF will fur up. We need to use sandpaper to get rid of this furring for our next coat, and this will lead to a better look and finish. We're using P240 sandpaper, which is a very fine sandpaper, which is perfect for a job like this, as we just want to smooth out the furring. We're going to use a small block behind our sandpaper so it's easier to sand out the flat sections of our board. And for the profile section, you'll just want to use a sandpaper on its own so you can fold and manipulate the paper depending on the part of the profile you're working with. You shouldn't have to do anything too strenuous while sanding it, but just rub your hand across and make sure it's smooth and the furring feel has gone. Two things you could use which may be easier and create a better finish are sandpaper pads or wire wool. The pads are more durable than the paper, which is thin and can tear and rip. The pads also give you a bit more flexibility when working on the profile section, as you can see here. The wire wool is the same for flexibility, as it can mould to the shape of the profile, particularly in the small crevices, and wire wool will also leave a really nice smooth finish too. But these are entirely down to personal preference. It's hard to portray this on camera compared to actually feeling it, but hopefully you can see how smooth the boards look. When you're doing it, just make sure you're feeling the boards. Now onto the second coat of our boards, and the same principles apply. A nice thin coat applied evenly, making sure that everywhere is covered. Obviously the boards will look a lot whiter than they did previously, but there still may be areas it's not completely white, but again that's fine as this is not our top coat. Once you're done, it's a repeat of last time. We have to wait for the boards to dry and then we give it one final round of prep. At risk of repeating myself, again the same principles apply to our first round of prep. Give it a light sand, making sure the boards are nice and smooth. And this is how our boards looked after 2 rounds of priming and 2 rounds of prep. They'll be ready to fit to our room and can have a top coat applied to them. The obvious things from this video that are worth noting is that if you are to do this at home, is making sure you have the required space for these boards, which can be up to 4 meters in length, the time to have them around while they're drying, and making sure that you have the correct equipment to hand. If you like to prime the boards after being fit, keep watching. An obvious negative with doing this is that you'll have to do 2 rounds of prime and prep on your hands and knees, which can be quite uncomfortable and unforgiving on your knees and back, especially if you're doing this in a large room. But you may not have the space to have these boards lying around for a long amount of time. You'll want to masking tape around what you're going to prime so that it doesn't get on the walls or the floor. A positive of this is that you're more than likely going to do this for when you apply your top coat, so at least the masking tape can be used during the priming and the painting process. As we did earlier in the video, start applying the primer to the board. Depending on the profile, it may be more difficult to see if you're getting primer throughout all the profile section, but just make sure you're being thorough when you're doing this. We won't go through the whole 2 rounds of prime and prep again, but here's a time lapse of the skirting and architrave being primed throughout the room. As you can see, you'll be up on a step ladder for the architrave and down on your hands and knees for the skirting. Whichever option you decide to go for is entirely down to personal preference and situation, but we hope that our video on how to prime has helped you, and if you do have any questions, please do let us know in the comments section.